June 14, 1918. A ground crewman named Charles Ashe tears open a crate stenciled L12 Liberty. He checks the paper seals, wipes away congealed grease, and taps the cylinder bank with a wrench to hear the ring. One engine for one aircraft for one sortie. He glances at the sky. Dawn patrol waits. The single sentence foreshadow sits in his head like a worry. Engines decide whether maps move. Cut wide to a room in Berlin where officers pass around a cable about American industry and smirk. The United States is late, they say. The United States builds cars, not warplanes. The United States cannot build aircraft engines fast enough to matter. The number that will erase that line, the number neither they nor the Americans yet grasp, is simple. Month by month, Liberty engines will climb from 0 to 4 figures, from a sketch on paper to crates that colonize French rail yards. Engines will be the unit that counts, the thing that multiplies airframes into squadrons and squadrons into a system. Not glamorous, not romantic, not the stuff of parades, just a part that turns fuel into lift with ruthless regularity. Engines decide whether maps move. By April 6, 1917, the day Washington declares war, the U.S. Army's Air Service has almost no combat aircraft and fewer frontline engines worth shipping. Europe consumes power plants faster than it consumes planes. Mechanics can patch wood and dope, but a seized motor kills a sortie, and a sortie missed can break a patrol chain. In 1916 and early 1917, Allied factories struggle to produce 4 reliable aircraft engines for every 5 fuselages. The ratio isn't accidental. It's physics, metallurgy, and calendar time compressing into a bottleneck. The Germans know this. They count on it. So the German general staff laughs, not in high comedy, in the tired worldly way of men who have counted tonnage. They think America's problem is airplanes. America's problem is engines. Here's what the Americans do in response. They design one engine, one pattern, multiple power ratings, a single production vocabulary scaled across an auto belt already practicing precision as religion. They choose standardization over variety, interchangeable parts over artisanal brilliance, speed over elegance. They call it the Liberty. The path to that choice begins earlier than most remember. On April 2, 1917, the president asks Congress for a declaration of war. Within weeks, a small cadre of officers in Washington writes a blunt requirement: an aircraft engine of high power, lightweight, and constructible in mass by firms that have never built one. The names attached to the assignment match the scale of the ask. Jesse G. Vincent from Packard, Elbert J. Hall from Hall Scott. One is a Detroit production wizard, the other a West Coast designer used to tearing weight out of everything he touches. Their brief is absurd. Their timeline is worse. Argue about genius, and the story turns into myth. Measure hours, and it becomes process. In late May 1917, in rooms that smell like graphite and varnish, draftsmen draw a V-12 with standardized cylinders, a modular approach that lets multiple companies machine the same parts to the same gauges. It is not the only engine in the world with that idea. It is the only engine that will marry the idea to the American automotive supply chain at speed. Vincent and Hall insist on a block architecture that a Ford or a Buick can understand without relearning its own language. Interchangeability is the hidden hero of the script. A lathe in Detroit and a lathe in Indianapolis must produce parts that bolt together without persuasion. Jigs and measuring blocks are not decorations. They are strategy. By July 3, 1917, a prototype runs. The date matters because the war does not slow for American calendar comfort. Each test stand hour becomes a kind of ransom payment against failure at altitude. The number on the dial, roughly 400 horsepower at 1,800 revolutions per minute, lands like a promise. The weight is kept within the envelope needed to lift bombs and cameras, to outrun albatrosses when luck runs thin. The fuel system can be produced with American carburetors and American lines. The water jackets can be cast with American habits. The bearings tell you the deeper point. They look like something you could order twice and receive the same thing both times. Precision is not a virtue here. It is the only path. Contracts follow. In August and September 1917, purchase orders fling themselves down the length of the industrial Midwest. Packard signs on. So do Buick and Cadillac. Ford prepares tooling. Nordyke and Marmon commits. The newly formed Lincoln Motor Company built around Henry Leyland's decision to turn his life and his factory over to the war, reorients entirely to Liberty production. Pierce Arrow adds capacity. So do others that know what a line looks like and how to speak its rhythm. Each one agrees to a scheme that would have sounded like fantasy in 1915. The same cylinder from Indiana and Michigan will fit the same crankcase in Ohio. The tool makers become the front line. The European war is a machine for trading time for blood. It rewards speed with saved lives and punishes delay with telegrams. By October 1917, American drawings mature into fixtures. Gauges proliferate. Inspectors multiply. Suppliers, used to nickel for car engines, adjust alloys for hours at high output. Heat treat schedules become doctrine. If you're keeping track of the science, what matters is not the exact chemistry, but the trust that the chemistry will repeat. Repeatability lets you plan. Plans move divisions. What do the German officers see from their side? They see America's late arrival. They hear stories of Dayton Wright building a British-designed airplane and of pilot complaints about visibility and fuel tanks. They hear that the U.S. will buy French engines because it cannot make its own in time. They hear, in other words, a familiar list of infant industry grievances. They overfit the data. They assume that because aircraft are a foreign art, engines are a foreign language. They mistake variety for capability and miss the wager being placed behind the curtain, a small set of interchangeable parts made everywhere at once. By January 1918, parts warehouses in the United States look different. Crates are stamped with dimensions and codes that line supervisors can read at a glance. The Liberty program invents its own paper trail. Every subassembly carries its inspection lineage. The number of gauges shipped is itself a statistic. This is not decoration. It is the mechanism by which 1,000 hands make one object that starts every time. If the cylinder walls measure within limits in Detroit, they will measure within limits in Bridgeport, and a mechanic in Issoudun will not have to re-engineer the engine on a tarp with a file. That sentence saves mornings. By March 1918, crates load onto ships. The Army does not ship engines only. It ships spare parts as a ratio. For every set of power plants on the manifest, multiples of gaskets and magnetos and water pumps accompany them. Repair parks in France receive stacks not as museum pieces, but as food for a working organism. And then, quietly, something changes at squadron level. Read the maintenance logs and the pattern emerges. Fewer sorties scrubbed for lack of power. Fewer cannibalizations. It is not dramatic. It is relentless. The DH-4, the Liberty plane, an American-built version of the British de Havilland design, becomes the main carrier of this new heart. It is not perfect. It moves the crew apart and earns a reputation harsher than it deserves. But it does what the system needs it to do: carry cameras, carry bombs, carry wireless sets, and return enough times to justify the math. Engines define whether the math works. You can add missions only if you can add engines. The numbers tell the story, the smirks forgot. In mid-1917, the United States produces effectively 0 frontline aircraft engines per month. By spring 1918, monthly Liberty output climbs into the hundreds. By late summer, it pushes into 4 figures. By the armistice, more than 20,000 Liberty engines are completed, with well over 10,000 shipped overseas and thousands installed in aircraft that fly real missions with real results. No one statistic captures the feeling of that acceleration on the ground. So you return to hands prying open crates, hands torquing head studs in muddy tents, hands signing inspection sheets in pencil because the ink froze last night. Charles Ash, the ground crewman from the tool sector, does not measure victory by production charts. He measures it by whether the patrol returns with film. On June 14, 1918, the algebra is simple. The engine he uncrated yesterday started this morning and will, God willing, start again after the refuel. When the mechanic can depend on the engine more than the weather, you are close to the turning. When the pilot trusts that the throttle is a lever and not a prayer, you are almost there. By July 1918, American squadrons use Liberty-powered DH-4s as routine tools. They photograph bridges. They adjust artillery. They bomb rail junctions in 2s and 4s and 8s. Read the mission summaries and note the tone. Standard. Standard is the quiet triumph of a logistics war. The German officers who laughed now see a map salted with new aerodromes, Rembercourt, Colombie, Clermont-en-Argonne, and a repair network that keeps the engines turning through heat, rain, and uncooperative French mud. Engines decide whether maps move. The maps move. What happened next made the pattern obvious. In September 1918, the Meuse-Argonne offensive begins. It will be the largest operation and victory of the American Expeditionary Forces. The air service flies thousands of sorties in support. Observation planes push forward with the infantry, sketching wire and gun positions hour by hour. Bombers hit the railheads that feed the German line. Pursuit squadrons swarm to keep them alive. The critical detail under the noise, sorties pile up because engines keep starting. Even when airframes crack and canvas tears, engine replacement and repair flow at a rate that keeps the line supplied with power. The best way to understand the Liberty is to imagine what would happen without it. Without interchangeable cylinders and standardized valves, each engine becomes a snowflake. Each snowflake becomes an exception. Exceptions pile up until they paralyze. With the Liberty, exceptions become the thing you notice because everything else is normal. A blown gasket is an hour of work, not a week of telegraphing for an exotic part. A cracked water jacket becomes a swap, not a grounding. The number of planes grounded for engines drops. The number of sorties per week rises. The number of photographs delivered to Corps headquarters increases. The artillery tables are fed. The trenches across from your line narrow into the exact target you want. But the contrast grew sharper than engine logs. The Liberty program retaught American managers a European lesson at American speed. A single family of parts unlocks a continent of capacity. Ford's practice with magnetos turns into an aviation skill overnight. Cadillac's habit of measuring in tenths where others measured in eighths becomes a survival mechanism. Packard's pride becomes national capability. Leland's decision to retool with hair shirt discipline, turn a luxury brand's attention to a muddy problem, creates an engine factory that opens its own logic. Plan first, then metal. This is not a heroic tale of a single brain. It is a theory of power in practice. The Liberty version of the theory says, pick a target output and then do everything to make repetition self-evident. The gauge blocks hitting machinists' palms are as revolutionary as the V-12's output at altitude. Because when you ship thousands of engines into a supply web, you ship a promise that each one is substantially the same animal. The promise is kept often enough to change outcomes. By October 1918, German observers write reports that start to sound threadbare. Claims that American aircraft cannot sustain operations are contradicted by the sky itself. Formation after formation crosses the line of trenches, not just once for photographers, but repeatedly for artillery correction and interdiction. The German infantrymen notice that the buzzing above is more persistent. The line officers notice that their courier routes take longer because railheads are hit more often. Staff officers notice that their own staff work lengthens by hours as American papers land with fresh coordinates. The intelligence officers notice that the Americans find the bridges faster. The only axis along which America is late still holds is the one that cannot matter by October: pride. What is the mystery reveal that reframes our earlier scene? It is the realization that the Liberty was less an engine than an interface between America's car factories and Europe's battlefields, between a drawing office and a bombardment, between a promise on paper and a squadron diary. The inversion is cruel to myth. It says the turning wasn't a genius pilot or a single duel in the clouds. It was a stack of crates at a railhead that made the difference between a plan written and a plan executed. The glamour runs to pilots. The leverage runs to engines. By the time the armistice arrives on November 11, 1918, the Liberty has done more than fly. It has taught. It has taught American officers that standardization is a weapon. It has taught American mechanics that an engine family, properly documented, lets them act like a factory in the field. It has taught politicians that you can convert a peacetime industry to a wartime tempo without destroying it, if you give it a task that rhymes with what it already knows. And it has taught the German staff one lesson they did not have to learn the hard way until it was too late. Do not laugh at a country that manufactures boredom for a living. For those who do it well, boredom, repetition, gauges, forms, is the shortest road to overwhelming. The thesis is a single line. Power at scale is the decisive invention. To feel the line land, return to the micro. A mechanic at Rembercourt shouts over the test stand. He listens for detonation with a length of broom handle held to the block. He adjusts the mixture by feel and then by chart. He checks the cooling lines and marks the clamp positions in chalk. The pilot, more often than not, never knows his name. But the engine's character, its willingness to run like yesterday and like tomorrow, turns the pilot's courage into a military instrument rather than a private act. The cause and effect chain is as clean as any in a messy war. A standardized design created inspectable parts. Inspectable parts created predictable engines. Predictable engines enabled sustained flight operations. Sustained flight operations provided continuous reconnaissance and attack. Continuous reconnaissance and attack eroded the opponent's logistics. Their logistics, not their line alone, decided whether they could retreat in order or collapse in place. The Meuse-Argonne proved the case in the language only big battles speak. Thousands of small actions compounded into a single direction of travel. Some will object. The Liberty had faults. Of course it did. Oil systems leaked. Installation in the DH-4 placed the fuel tank where fear and rumor made a nickname. Maintenance demanded time. Americans sometimes lacked. None of that changes the arithmetic. The altitude reached, the speed maintained, the sorties repeated. These are the coins that buy influence in a war of material. The Liberty minted those coins in quantity. Faults in the periphery did not outweigh the center. An engine that could be built by the 1,000 and kept running by the 100 at once in a theater that ate power like hunger. Consider the before and after. Before the Liberty, American planners expected Europe to supply engine solutions while the United States built airframes and trained pilots. After the Liberty, the flow reversed. Engines moved eastward in numbers. Airframes followed. Training found its rhythm. Maintenance learned its lists. The delta can be measured with precision. Where one engine in mid-1917 represented a novelty, by late 1918, dozens represented a day's dose for a single sector. That is a ratio that turns smirks into statistics. Zoom out to the macro again. The Liberty's real victory lies not in defeating a specific German engine model, but in normalizing a system that could be scaled to almost anything mechanical. It proved that an American industrial culture obsessed with gauges, fixtures, and time studies could become an arsenal without losing its soul to fragility. It also proved that European staff work, superb at mobilizing rail timetables and food calendars, could be surprised by a sea of parts that simply did not run out. When you can drop replacements on the problem until the problem is bored, you have changed the geometry of the fight. By the early 1920s, the aftershocks show up in peacetime. Liberty engines power speedboats and experimental aircraft, their surplus turned into sport and study. Lincoln becomes a car brand acquired by Ford, its war-born precision turned into peacetime luxury. Packard takes the lessons forward to the next generation of engines. In every company ledger, in every training manual that now includes sections on standardized inspection, you can see the ghost of the earlier decision. Pick one design, make it reproducible, crush variance until variance cries uncle. The German General Staff, in their post-war autopsies, do not write, "We laughed at American engines." They write about shortages of food and steel and men. They write about the depth of Allied material superiority. But if you listen more closely, you can hear an undertone. The enemy could replace what we destroyed faster than we could destroy it. Air power contributed to that imbalance not only by dropping bombs, but by seeing. Seeing needs flying. Flying needs engines that run. An army starved of information fights ghosts. The Liberty starved the German army of certainty. Let us come back to a single detail, the ratio of engines to spare parts in a shipment. It is a dull number that contains drama. If the War Department sends one engine without the pump that fits that engine, the engine becomes a sculpture in a shed. But if it sends a pump that fits any of a family's serial numbers without fuss, it sends time. The Army learned to ship time. Repair parks turned that time into sorties. Sorties turned into photographs. Photographs turned into coordinates. Coordinates turned into corrected fire. Corrected fire turned into fissures in the enemy line. Those fissures turned into a retreat, measured first in yards, then in miles. The Liberty's climb from drawing to dominance also reveals a quiet American inversion. Before 1917, many believed aviation was a European art best left to European masters. The Americans imported talent and ideas and doubted their own. By November 1918, the Americans had demonstrated a different proposition. They may not lead in elegant airframe design on day one, but give them a system problem and they will solve it by making it dull, and then making dullness abundant. In war, dull abundance often beats brilliant scarcity. Remember the date on the Creighton tool. Remember the ring of the cylinder under Ash's wrench. That sound, metal answering a question honestly, is the sound that fades the laughter in Berlin. Not through rhetoric, but through repetition. Not through a single charismatic machine, but through identical ones appearing everywhere at once, ordered like a drill team of pistons. Climax lives in inversion. At the beginning, German officers saw a late America and an impossible production task. At the end, they saw a country that treated impossibility as a scheduling problem. The turning insight is that the Liberty engine was a schedule turned into steel. You can mock a promise. You cannot mock a crate that opens and runs. The thesis stated cleanly: in modern war, the side that turns power into a commodity wins. In the resolution, consequences spread out. The experience of building Liberty engines becomes a template used in the next crisis, with new materials and new assembly lines, to build entirely different weapons at scales more frightening. It sets a precedent. Decide on the pattern early, then build the world around the pattern until deviation is harder than conformity. It informs how air forces think about engines as fleets rather than as pets. It tells civilian industry something too, that complex products can be treated like puzzles already solved, provided you lock down the pieces in ways machines understand. A final comparison settles the case. On paper, the war began with the German air service confident, battle-proven, and exquisitely tuned to the rhythm of trench warfare's first years. On paper, the United States arrived with almost nothing, a junior partner whose flying boots were still soft. On the ground, in the sky, by October 1918, the picture inverted, slowly, then suddenly. The Americans moved from borrowing power to producing it, from waiting to scheduling, from promising to shipping. The Liberty engine was not alone in that shift, but it was the clearest emblem. It made the invisible visible. Repetition winning. Outro. Return to the opening image. Another dawn at another field in October 1918. A mechanic's hands, chapped and blackened, tighten the last nut on a cylinder head. He steps back, signals the start, and the engine coughs, then catches, then settles into the smooth impatience of 12 cylinders ready to work. He doesn't smile. It is only one more engine of many. That is the point. Not through a single marvel, but through a flood of reliable machines. Not by dazzling, but by delivering. The sound subsides into the day's noise, which is another way of saying silence for those who thought it couldn't be done.